Dr. Bernard Nathanson is a remarkable testament to how the vigorous pursuit of the truth can lead a person to the incredible mercy of God and become a cause for good. Dr. Nathanson was an American physician from New York who gained national attention by becoming one of the founding members of the National Association for the Repeal of Abortion Laws, now known as NARAL, Pro-Choice America. Along with a few others, his efforts helped put in place legislation that paved the way for the Roe v. Wade and Doe v. Bolton Supreme Court decisions that opened the doors to the legalization of abortion on demand throughout the U.S. He was also the director of the Center for Reproductive and Sexual Health at what may have been the most active abortion clinic the world has ever known. With the development of ultrasound in the 1970s and in the interest of science, Dr. Nathanson decided to observe and film an abortion in progress. What he observed caused him to change his view on the personhood of unborn children and true nature of abortion. In 1979, Nathanson declared himself to be pro-life and produced 2 groundbreaking documentaries that have been instrumental to countless thousands, including many physicians, by presenting critical information for those interested in the truth. Formerly an avowed atheist, in 1996, Nathanson converted to Roman Catholicism, crediting the efforts of Reverend C. John McCloskey, a priest of Opus Dei. Speaking from his own experience and his acceptance of the gravity of his past actions, he declared that no religion matches the special role for forgiveness that is afforded by the Catholic Church. Bernard Nathanson died in February 2011 at the age of 84. At the end of Dr. Nathanson's presentation, there is a question and answer session and a special bonus segment from Archbishop Fulton Sheen. Here now is the life story of Dr. Bernard Nathanson.
Thank you. I want to give you a brief overview of what it is like to have been a leader in the pro-abortion movement in the United States, and in fact over the world, and then the director of the largest abortion clinic that ever existed. Its like will never be seen again. And then a scientific odyssey to pro-life and a spiritual odyssey to Christianity. I hope you will move along with me and forgive me my emotional moments. This is always a difficult experience to speak of this. I grew up, and all of this is contained in this book. It's called The Hand of God. I grew up in a household in which my father was a man who had been trained to be an Orthodox rabbi. His father had been a pharmacist who had killed himself when my father was only 2 years old. His father had acquired tuberculosis. And it was the custom in those days, we're now speaking about the very last part of the 19th century, to send people who suffered from tuberculosis to sanitaria in the mountains on the theory that the mountain air would somehow cure the tuberculosis. My father's father was sent out to Colorado by the family, but their poverty was so grinding and so abysmal, and there were no social safety nets in those days, no welfare, no Medicaid, no supplemental income, nothing. My father's mother had 4 children, little children. Her husband was now in Colorado. She took in washing and did seamstress work. And they sent whatever money they had to keep my father's father alive and eating in Colorado. But one day he discovered that the family was starving itself to keep him there. So he hanged himself in the closet one day, suicide. And then my father's mother remarried a ritual Orthodox slaughterer from Ottawa. And she had 4 children, but the slaughterer, the sheikhet, had 5 children of his own. So he could only accept one of my grandmother's children, and that was my father, who was the youngest. All the other children were sent to orphanages in New York. So the family was split. And my father went and grew up in Canada in terrible poverty. He used to tell me stories about how he was so poor that he attended medical school but never had the money to buy an overcoat in Montreal in the dead of winter. He would simply put newspapers under his shirt and old used blotters from the railroad station in his shoes to keep his feet dry. Nevertheless, he was a very persistent and determined man and graduated from medical school with honors. He rationed himself to $1 a day for eating throughout the 4 years, and he became so anemic as a result of this impossible diet that there were numerous threats to drop him from medical school because his medical condition was so bad. But he persisted, and a kindly professor took to inviting him for a Saturday evening meal. And they would then give him a bag of food to take home, and he would use it for the rest of the week. And one means or another, he struggled and got himself through medical school. When you've been that poor, it never leaves you, no matter how much money you make. My father died an extremely wealthy man, but in his mind, he was always poor and on the verge of starvation. He was trained, as I said, to be a rabbi and pursued that calling until he was about 17 or 18 years old and finished his first year of medical school. Then he decided that the teachings of Orthodox Judaism were in such conflict with the scientific data that he had acquired from medical school that he could no longer reconcile them. Some great thinkers have been able to do that. Maimonides, Moses ben Maimonides, a rabbi in the 12th century, could reconcile the teachings of Aristotle with the teachings of the Orthodox Jewry and wrote a book called The Guide for the Perplexed. But it's a very difficult book, and unless you're really serious about philosophy, it's almost incomprehensible. So my father broke. He just broke from Judaism. But on the other hand, he was every inch the Jew. He spoke fluent Yiddish. He was only comfortable in the company of other Jewish people. And he attended the synagogue on the high holy days, such as Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. But as far as his belief in God and religion, he had none. He was really what a lot of people have referred to as a stiff-backed Jewish atheist. There's a lot of truth in what that says. He felt it a duty to send me to Hebrew school and religious school on Sundays, although he himself didn't believe in any of this. So dutifully, after class 3 times a week in grammar school, I would then leave and go to Hebrew school. And this went on for many years. And then on Sundays, I would go to Hebrew school or Sunday school as well. So I really was attending religious school 4 times a week and got a very deep and comprehensive education in all things Jewish and learned to speak Hebrew. The problem was, of course, that when I would come home and tell my father on Sundays or other days what I had learned, he would simply deride me. He would laugh and destroy those things I had learned with a cogent remark, which was enough to tear down the edifice of anything I had learned. And I was really caught in a whipsaw. I would learn these things, and then my father, whom I worshipped, would destroy them for me. And I was left really utterly bewildered for many years about God and religion. I did proceed to a bar mitzvah at the age of 13 and got the requisite fountain pens, which everybody gets at that time. and thereafter never again set foot in the synagogue. Never. And I drifted along, went through college and medical school, of course, did my work, graduated with honors, but I was adrift. I really had no beacon, no lights to guide me spiritually, except perhaps the few readings I had done in the philosophy of medicine. I went through 2 wives in a period of perhaps 10 years. The marriages foundered, both of them, on a mutual lack of interest in anything other than worldly, mundane pleasures. The restaurants and the horse farms and the money and the acquisitions which flowed in as a result of my being very successful in private practice of medicine, of obstetrics. And then in 1968, at a dinner party, I met a man who knew a great deal about abortion. Now, I had been a resident in obstetrics and gynecology and in practice thereafter, and I knew at that time that we had our wards filled with women who had gone to midwives or nurses or plain lay people for their abortions, and they had been maimed and ruined medically. They would end up either dead in our emergency rooms, or they would end up seriously ill, spending weeks and even months in the hospital with operation after operation, and end up finally with a hysterectomy and permanently sterilized as a result of these botched abortions. Well, it was a time of anti-authoritarianism. There was a wave of revulsion against authority in the late 60s. The hippie culture was flourishing. The Vietnam War was on, and people were marching against it. There were assassinations of high political figures. It was a time of great turbulence and turmoil. But the overriding theme of that time was the rebellion against authority. Now, the abortion laws had stood for at least 100 years, those laws which restricted abortion in the United States. For example, in New York State, the law restricting abortion only to those women whose lives were in danger as a result of the pregnancy had stood since 1829. But this man later, Lawrence Lader, that I met at this party, had just published the first book. It was called Abortion, which called for abortion on demand. And I struck up a conversation with him, and we suddenly clicked together, and I found myself allied with him politically, organizing the NARAL, the national, we called it in those days the National Association for Repeal of Abortion Laws. It's now known as the National Abortion Rights Action League. But basically, it was a political lobbying group to strike down all laws restricting abortion in this country and overseas. And I traveled extensively, lobbied in legislatures, spoke to any politician I could find, and so did Lader. We raised money, we persuaded the media, and the media then were composed of young, radicalized women who were just getting out of college and had been educated in this anti-authoritarian era. And they were our ready allies. And we persuaded them to come aboard, and we enlisted them in the crusade. And very shortly thereafter, within a period of 2 years, we had been successful in striking down the New York State abortion statute, and in its place put a law in allowing abortion up to 24 weeks with no reason at all. It was abortion on demand. And at that point, other states began to fall into line. When we broke the law in New York State, our business was not finished. We had made abortion available, but now we had to see that it was done properly and that it was not going to be a fiasco medically and surgically. So at first, I made it my business to inspect the few little abortion clinics in the city which were functioning. They were all terrible. They were all set up by entrepreneurs who wanted to make a huge profit. And finally, in January of 1971, I decided to take over a clinic which was then functioning but about to close and regularize it and get it a license. It was by far the largest clinic ever envisioned. And I did. It was called the Center for Reproductive and Sexual Health, a nice euphemism. It was located on the east side of Manhattan. I had 35 doctors working for me there and 85 nurses. We were doing 120 abortions every day, including Sundays, and we were never closed except for Christmas. And in the 2 years that I was the director there, we did 60,000 abortions. During those years, I was also doing abortions as part of my practice and teaching residents how to do them. That added up to another 15,000 abortions, so I suppose I have something like 75,000 abortions in my life, which is a pretty heavy baggage. I did succeed in doing what I had promised. I regularized the clinic, threw out all the hopeless derelicts who were working there as doctors. We had the whole gamut. We had sexual molesters, we had drunks, we had junkies, we had sadists as doctors. We even had one man who was a fugitive from the FBI. I was there about a week when the FBI came in to interview me and said, "Have you seen this doctor?" And I said, "Yeah, he's in room 3. And of course, he'd seen the FBI. He disappeared. I never saw him again. But it was a terrible situation when I took it over, and gradually, as I said, we regularized it, got some reasonably expert doctors to come in and do the work by paying them outrageously. And gradually it became the model clinic for every clinic functioning in the Western world. Planned Parenthood visited the clinic that I ran frequently and took copious notes and even had me come down and talk to them. And finally they set up their own clinic about a year or two later, modeled completely on the clinic that I had run. Ours was the first licensed clinic in the country. I'm not going to go into detail about what we did there. The stories are in this book. Some of them are heartbreaking. Some of them are so bizarre that you can only sit and shake your head over them. But after 2 years, I really had had enough. I was very busy. I had a small child then. I was on my 3rd marriage. And I was still practicing full-time in obstetrics and gynecology. And I was really played out, burned out, and I summarily quit at the end of 72 or the beginning of 73 after 2 years. And then I sat back and began to reflect on what had happened there. Now, I don't mean reminisce. That's different. I wasn't just remembering incidents. I was reflecting on what had happened, distilling my experiences into some comprehensible philosophic and psychological corpus, if you will, some body of idea that I could contemplate and work with. And the reflections were mostly scientific, because it was just at that time, in 73, that when I left the clinic, I was offered a job as chief of obstetrics at the St. Luke's Hospital. That's a very large teaching hospital for Columbia University Medical School. And we were just moving in all of the new equipment, ultrasound particularly, and fetal heart electronic monitoring, all of these new technologies which gave us a window into the womb. And for the first time, I began to have some appreciation of what we had been doing at that clinic and elsewhere, what an abortion really was and what it was not. So I wrote an editorial in the New England Journal of Medicine that was called Deeper into Abortion, and I would just raise certain questions, that's all. I had no conclusions. It was not a pro-life piece. But I just raised certain troubling questions. The journal to this day has never received as much mail as in response to an article or an editorial as they did to that one. For my pains, I was simply drummed out of NARAL. At that time, I was on the executive committee and chairman of the medical committee. I was simply drummed out, just told to resign. There was no room in that organization even for questions. It was really quite a communist experience, a Stalinist experience, if you will. But for the next few years, I was doing what is called fetology, studying the fetus. And as a result of doing that, I came to the conclusion that what we had in the womb was a living human being and a person, an individual, someone launched on the trajectory of life. You know, the trajectory of life is interesting. It's really composed of three parts. There's a potential. That's that first 9 months, which are probably the most important 9 months in your life because that's when you're being formed. And then there's the actual, the zenith, when we're at our prime. And then what someone has called the residual, when we begin to decline and lose our powers and move on into old age. But that's the trajectory, that's the natural trajectory, and we have to live that out. And any interruption of that, artificial interruption, is unacceptable ethically. Well, I wrote a book called Aborting America. In 1979, it was published, and it expressed these views. It analyzed the ethical dilemma of abortion. And of course, it came down on the pro-life side. And since that time, I have been allied essentially with pro-life. Now, please don't misunderstand me. I wrote this book and changed my mind and did all the things I did without a glimmer of recognition of a supreme being, of God, of anything. There was nothing religious about anything I did in those years. This was purely done on a level of science, not belief, not faith. It was done in the spirit of scientific certainty. Of course, somebody once said that certainty is a poor substitute for hope, and it's probably true. About 1984, I began to wonder what it really was that was happening during an abortion. I mean, we'd done hundreds of thousands, millions of them, but nobody really ever saw what actually happened to this human being in the womb, this person. And I don't quail at calling it a person. And I'll tell you why. When you hear the language of personhood, and that's the argument that the pro-choice people always raise, this is not a person. I want to tell you that the language of personhood is exceedingly dangerous language. It is exclusionary language. It excludes, it does not include. For example, Jews were not viewed as persons in Germany. Gypsies were not viewed as persons. And on and on. Every time someone is excluded with this language of personhood, tragedy follows, and tragedy on a mass scale. And when I hear that language of personhood, it immediately conjures up for me the Holocaust and various other destructive nightmare experiences in human history. So when you hear that language, personhood, you know someone is talking about themselves being a person, having personhood conferred on them. If you ask them who conferred it on them, they don't know, of course. Other persons, I guess they say. But when they talk about persons, better be careful. Anyway, I commissioned a physician friend of mine who was doing abortions, doing around 30 or 40 every weekend, to put an ultrasound machine on the abdomen of the women he was aborting and film it. Just turn the machine on and record it on tape, what was happening during the abortion. Ultrasound, as you know, penetrates right through to the fetus and gives you a picture of the fetus. And when we reviewed the tapes, we were so appalled by what we saw. We could see the arms and the legs of the fetus being pulled off by the suction machine and the head being crushed, that the doctor who was doing the abortions was simply distraught. He never did, by the way, another abortion again. So I took one of the best tapes and we made a film around it. It was called, many of you are familiar with it, The Silent Scream. It had enormous impact in terms of publicity, in terms of notoriety, but politically it failed. It just didn't change any minds. It was attacked ferociously by the pro-choice people. They wheeled out all their big guns medically, tried to destroy the credibility of the film, and we wheeled out our big guns, and the fight started, and it's still going on. But in 1987, I again became interested, this time in the subject of late abortion. And so I enlisted a physician to put a fetoscope, an instrument which had an eyepiece on one end and a lens and a light on the other, and it's put directly through the woman's abdomen into her womb. This woman was 19 and a half weeks pregnant. We clamped a camera on the eyepiece, and then the doctor started to do what is called a D&E, literally breaking the bag of water and tearing the child apart. And we filmed it through this eyepiece. You can see everything going on. It was so strong that even today, I still quail as I watch it. Interestingly, at Vanderbilt University, there is a course called Life Before Birth. And surprisingly, I was astonished. At a secular university, the professor and chairman of the department asked me not only to show the film, which was called Eclipse of Reason, but to comment on it to the class. This is really simply unparalleled in my experience, which I did. And I was really so pleased that a student stopped me later on the same day who had been in the class, who'd watched the film. He stopped me on campus and said, "You know, your film really crystallized a lot of questions for me. It really resolved a lot of my doubts. I now know what late abortion is all about, and it's unacceptable." He had been pro-choice all down the line. And I was really pleased by that, deeply pleased by it. In any case, that film, too, became the subject of great controversy, although it was a better film than The Silent Scream, and in fact, it won awards at 5 major film festivals and was nominated for an Academy Award in the documentary division. Did not win, but at least it had a nomination. At some point, late in the 80s and early in the 90s, having done these films, written books, and demonstrated medically what abortion was, I plunged into a very serious, profound depression. I found myself almost unable to go to work. I was deeply troubled by what I had done in my life. Another marriage was falling apart. My son was emotionally disturbed. I was getting older. And as I looked back, all I could see was the baggage of 75,000 little lives that I had destroyed, and a great many adult lives that I had damaged. And I remember reading the words of Yeats, the great Irish poet. He said in a poem called Sailing to Byzantium, "Consume my heart away, sick with desire, and fastened to a dying animal, it knows not what it is. Gather me into the darkness of eternity." And another snatch of poetry, which I'd always lived with, is "When the doomed are most eloquent in their sinking, it seems we are least strong to save." I really reached bottom spiritually in those years. I was in the state that Santayana described when he said the keenest of human tortures is to be judged without a law. In fact, I should point out that in 1979, my sister, my only sibling, for reasons no one understands, killed herself. One August morning, she was found dead in bed with a bottle of pills. She had 3 children. And I must say that in the late 80s and about that time, I felt the same way. I really felt there was no reason to go on. But riding to my rescue was a man named Father John McCloskey, an Opus Dei priest who had somehow heard of my plight. And he began to talk to me. First we had just desultory conversation. And then gradually we began to penetrate to more central things. And I began to think that maybe the path that I had chosen to despise myself was not constructive, and that there was hope to be found. There was hope there, the hope of redemption, of the cleansing of sin, and of the shedding of this intolerable baggage. Santayana again said perhaps the only true dignity of man is his ability to despise himself. That was the state of mind that I was in. And gradually, Father McCloskey got me interested in reading first. He knew that he could not appeal to me except first through the intellect, and then into the heart. And that's how he did it, with the skill and the unerring accuracy of a cardiac surgeon. He knew exactly how to reach me. And gradually I became more and more interested, attending religious retreats. I was not unaware that I was still Jewish. I consulted several rabbis during this period of crisis. The response was inadequate. There was no true hope of cleansing, redemption, expiation, and the shedding of the baggage. And it was simply inadequate for me. And so I went along, and gradually understanding that my only hope of salvation was in the peace of Christ, to the point where I stand before you now as a believing Christian. I want you to understand that I am still Jewish in tradition and heritage, and I will never leave that behind. I think the tradition and the heritage are magnificent. But with the coming of Christ and the promise of redemption and salvation, I stopped thinking of suicide, closed my office, went down to Georgetown and then Vanderbilt to pursue my interests in bioethics and resume a new life. I have been, in many senses, reborn, resurrected, renewed. And today I am finally finding some peace. You know, Pascal once said that, and this is known as Pascal's wager, said the cost of believing in God is minimal, but the consequences of doubt can be significant. It's a nice fence straddle. But Pascal was a believer, and he was trying to appeal to those who simply could not make up their minds on this issue. I don't have any doubts anymore. I am happy with what I have, happy with what I believe in, looking forward to a future which is indeterminable, but I've learned one thing, that I, and not any other human, cannot control my life. It is in the hands of God, and that's why I call this book The Hand of God. I want to relinquish control of my life, and I have. I don't think any of us can be trusted to control human life. That's why I am unalterably opposed to euthanasia, physician-assisted suicide, abortion, anything which deals with human beings controlling life. Well, thank you for your time, and I appreciate your patience.
Dr. Nathanson will now entertain any questions.
Question is, how do you sidewalk counsel and demonstrate at the same time? I think in the book I wrote, and it's true, that the turning point in my conversion was a demonstration I witnessed in front of a Planned Parenthood abortion clinic in New York in 1989. When I watched all of the people, the demonstrators, sitting quietly in front of that clinic, chanting and praying, and there was something emanating from their faces. The closest thing I can approximate, I suppose, is love. This was a selfless, self-sacrificing, almost ecstatic experience of love. And I picked up the emanations, the aura of love from every one of those demonstrators sitting there in front of that clinic. And it was, I think, the watershed point for me when I saw that and felt this tremendous suffusion of love. That was what convinced me beyond a doubt that I had to find the source of that love, of that peace, coming from those masses of people who sat there fully expecting to be beaten, to be fined, to be humiliated. They knew they were going to go through that experience, and in a Christ-like way, they accepted it, and the only thing missing, I suppose, was the lack, someone did not say, "It is finished." But other than that, it was truly a religious epiphany for me, an epiphany. And I do not know their names, but I am forever grateful to them. Question, the pillars of abortion are crumbling. You've had a change of heart, as has Norma McCorvey and Sandra Cano. Norma McCorvey was Roe in Roe v. Wade, and Sandra Cano was Doe in Doe v. Bolton. Who do you predict is next to embrace life? I think that Americans will embrace life in all its facets within the next 10 years. I think there is evidence everywhere that we are fed up with the so-called secular pillars of certainty. But they're all cracking around us, that the technology is running away with us, that our voices are being lost or not heard. And I think Americans want to control, to some extent, their destiny and turn their lives back to God. So I think that soon, and I don't know when, but soon, there will be a revulsion with this secular humanism, the notion, the farcical idea that we can control our lives. We cannot. Question, is a woman awake or sedated during an abortion procedure? Answer, in the first trimester, for the first 3 months, the woman is awake and not sedated, or at least very lightly sedated. The procedure is done under what is called local anesthesia, which is Novocaine. In the second and third trimesters, that is after the 12th week, generally, the woman is put under general anesthesia. She is put to sleep. Kate Michelman, who's director of NARAL, made a very serious mistake when she testified before the Congress that for these partial term or partial birth abortions, what kills the baby is not the abortionist, but the anesthesia. Even though the abortionist pulls the baby down, the head is in the cervix, in the neck of the womb, and the doctor sticks a huge scissors into the baby's skull, that's not what kills the baby. No, not at all. She said it's the anesthesia, which is, of course, so patently absurd that it really doesn't require comment, except that the anesthesiologists, the president of the American Society of Anesthesiologists, got up next in Congress and declared her a bald-faced liar, that the anesthesia had nothing to do with it. He was not pro-life, by the way. I mean, understand that. He was just talking straight, pure medicine. And he was appalled that anyone would make such an irresponsible statement, and he made the very good argument that when you say this, you are ignoring the fact that every day we operate for other reasons on pregnant women. They don't die. The babies don't die of the anesthesia. They do very well, as a matter of fact. We have done open heart surgery on pregnant women in the first and second trimesters. Babies do fine. And that's 8 or 10 hours of anesthesia. Question, could you comment on what our opponents say about the silent scream and your rebuttal? Well, I touched on that, but essentially, it goes something like this. During the silent scream, many of you know, we slowed down the pace of the film deliberately, and I said so in the film. I said, we're going to now put this in slow motion so you can see precisely what is happening. And then we went back to normal speed. Our opponents said that I had been manipulating the tape, that it was not at the proper speed that it should have been, that it was speeded up, that it was slowed down, and so on and so on, and that I had fabricated some of the tape. There were all sorts of comments and criticisms from highly placed people in ultrasound technology and in obstetrics and gynecology. Well, what we did, finally, was two things. First, I interviewed the doctor, Dr. J. Kellinson, who had done the abortion we showed in the silent scream. And he had seen the tape. And he took an oath on videotape that what you saw in that film was exactly the way it happened. That is still a film which one can purchase from Bernadelle. It's called The Answer. It runs 15 minutes. It's a short film, but it's a probing interview of Dr. Kellinson. The other thing we did was we sent the film to Dr. Ian Donald in Scotland. Now, Dr. Donald is the father of ultrasound technology. He invented it in the 50s. He knows more about ultrasound, or knew more about ultrasound, than anyone in the world. Unfortunately, he's dead. Died several years ago. But we sent the film, untouched, unedited, everything, to him, and I said, look, give me a frank and honest opinion of whether this has been doctored or manipulated in any way, shape, or form. He not only said it had not been doctored, but he took an oath. He signed an affidavit. We have pictures of him signing the affidavit, in which he said that film was exactly the way it happened. The film had never been doctored, that it was simply a documentary which showed exactly what happens during an abortion. Well, we produced these proofs, but of course, you know the press. They seize on every thing which is in their favor, and they put on page 32 in a small box at the very back of the paper any corrections or errata that they may have made. And so, of course, they put a small little box. Most of the press or some of the television people put an aside in that the film had been validated by so-and-so. They didn't say who Dr. Donald was or anything else. And today, even now, that film is still the subject of criticism, even though we have had it validated by the two people who knew more about it than anyone else. Any other questions? Oh, thank you. Question, why, after your concrete evidence about what happens to the fetus during an abortion, why are physicians still performing them? Well, why are there disbelievers? Why are there people who don't believe that there is peace in Christ? Who can account for human nature? Some of it is avarice, greed, cupidity. You know, the abortion industry has undergone a very interesting sea change. It started out when the laws broke with clinics, but most of the abortions were still being done by private doctors in their practice. They would have a pregnant woman in their practice, they'd put them in a hospital, and they'd do the abortion and the woman would go home. It quickly became clear that that was impossible to continue. First, we were taking up too many hospital beds that way, and people needing acute care were being left out. And secondly, the operating rooms could not absorb the whole flow of patients. It was simply crowding out the operating schedules. So the concept of the clinic, which I proved in my experience, arose. Ambulatory care. Walk in, get your operation, walk out. And that's where virtually all abortions are being done now. And as a result, most doctors, obstetricians and gynecologists in private practice are no longer doing abortions. And in fact, they don't like the whole subject. They don't teach it. They don't want to talk about it. The classical picture is the young resident who gets out of the residency in obstetrics and gynecology, graduates. Now remember, she or he has had 4 years of college, 4 years of medical school, and 4 years of residency, 12 years of education, no money coming in. These doctors are getting out into practice with government loans over them in the neighborhood of $150,000, $200,000. That's how they managed to go through all of this training. They need to make money and make it fast. They've got to pay off these loans. And building up a practice is very difficult, or has been very difficult. The nature of medical practice is changing with managed care. But up till now, it's been get out and practice and get a practice going and make some money. Well, that takes 10 or 15 years. And the government wants its money. So the nearest way to do it and the quickest is go to an abortion clinic. They'll pay you, make good money, and you're off the hook. And that's where most of the abortionists are coming to and from. That's where you'll find them. Are you not afraid that the situation of the abortion before 1967 causing much damage to illegally aborted women would come back if abortion became illegal again? A very good question, but I must tell you this, the questioner and people generally, that the death rate from abortions was dropping rapidly even before it became legal. If a woman would become sick or damaged as a result of abortion, we had more powerful antibiotics, we had more blood transfusion technology, we had intensive care units with people specially trained to deal with sick people. The whole technology of medicine had changed enormously. So I predict that if we criminalized abortion tomorrow morning, women would simply go and get their abortions what is called medically. The clinics would close, but they would be given RU-486 or other drugs which will produce abortion. I think, however, that law is more than just a curb, more than just a restriction. It's a statement of the health of a society. And if a society fails to protect its most vulnerable and its most innocent, that society is sick. And I think this society must make a strong statement that we are committed to the preservation of the lives of those most vulnerable, the dying, the fetuses, all of the people who live at the edges of life. And if we do not, we will remain a sick society. What would you say to someone who says they are Catholic but don't believe we should impose beliefs on others? Well, of course, we're always imposing our belief on others. I mean, every election is an imposition of beliefs on others. Just, for example, Mario Cuomo was governor of New York State for 12 years, I believe. Every year, the legislature, which was the will of the people, would send him a bill which said, we want capital punishment. Now, I personally don't believe in capital punishment. I do not like it and do not endorse it. But every year, the people of New York State would say, we want capital punishment in this state. And every year, Cuomo would impose his personal beliefs by vetoing it. He didn't believe in capital punishment. Well, that's the imposition of personal belief. Yet somehow the press conveniently and the media conveniently ignored that. Well, of course we have to impose morality. If we don't, who will? Morality is not something which just floats around and sticks to you. Somebody has got to enunciate it, somebody has got to clarify it, and somebody has got to explain it. Sorry, that's the way it is. Next question. Can you explain your use of the word potential to refer to life before birth when you talk about the trajectory of life? Yes. I did not mean it in the sense that the pro-choicers mean it, that it somehow the fetus has a potential to be a human being or a person. The fetus is a human being or a person filled with potential to do, to compose music, to paint, to construct great literature, to save lives in medicine, any number of things. There is the potential. It's not a potential human being, it is a human being, but it has great potential to do all of the things which make a society healthy and happy. That's what I meant by the word potential. Finally, what do you think of socialized medicine and how can we provide for the future medical needs of our children? Oh, it's a question which I could take probably 3 or 4 hours, if not days, talking about. As all of you know, there is, I described it, a sea change going on in medical care. One of our major topics in bioethics is what is the direction of medical care? And I think most of us in bioethics believe that our autonomy, our ability to make our decisions about our own lives in medical care is now so constricted by the HMOs and managed care who say to you, no, you can't do that, it's too expensive, that we are going to revolt. There is going to be a major revolt against these HMOs, and I don't know after the revolution where we will go, whether it will be to a single payer like the government, or whether we will simply go back to the old days of private practice. I just don't know. But I know one thing, managed care will strangle itself on profits. It will die on the profit motive. Because healthcare is bottomless, it's limitless. Finally, do you believe that you were used by God in order that you can be used today by the church against abortions? Answer unequivocally, yes. Thank you.
We hope you've enjoyed this presentation from Dr. Bernard Nathanson. And now, Lighthouse Catholic Media is pleased to provide a short bonus talk by Archbishop Fulton Sheen. This talk was taken from the presentation entitled, There is Life in the Womb. You can find the full presentation at lighthousecatholicmedia.org. And now, here is Archbishop Fulton Sheen.
Now this has to be a special talk tonight, therefore I will not be like the professor who traveled about this country in motor car and chauffeur, always giving the same lecture. One day the chauffeur said to him, I think I've heard that lecture of yours 1,000 times, and I could give it just as well as you do. All right, said the professor. You stand up on the platform tonight, give the lecture. I will sit out in the audience in your chauffeur's uniform. The chauffeur gave a perfect lecture. But at the end, hand went up. There's a question I would like to ask you. When you mix that H2SO4 with that NaCl2 and compare it with the photographic plates of the sun, how do you get the equation E equals m over c squared? He said, that's the most stupid question I ever heard in all my life. And to show you how stupid it is, I'm going to ask my chauffeur to answer it. Have you noticed that it is only within the last 50 years that we ever had to use the words right to life? All peoples have universally believed in the life and its right. Code of Hammurabi, centuries before Christ, believed in it. So something has changed. Now, behind every single movement is a philosophy. You see, I'm a philosopher, so I'm not going to speak to you as a medic, I'm not going to speak to you as a lawyer, but as a philosopher. And everyone has a philosophy of life. G.K. Chesterton said, when you sit down in a dentist's chair, that dentist has a right to ask you, what is your philosophy of life? Because if your philosophy of life is wrong, he can't be sure you'll ever pay your bill. So everyone has a philosophy of life. Now, what is the philosophy of life behind abortion? That's what we're going to inquire into first. Let me give you some examples of philosophies of life. For example, when the Nazis said that the Nordics were the chosen race and others were unfit to live in the nation, from that point on, you just could not stop the killing of the Jews because the philosophy was wrong. In Russia, the basic philosophy is the party alone matters. Well, just as soon as an individual disagrees with the party, he's sent to an insane asylum and declared mad. Take the Christian philosophy of life. Certain consequences follow from this. A friend of mine who had spent 7 years in a communist prison and was originally a Jewess, she became a Christian. One day before the communists came into Romania, her country, a Nazi called on her husband, who was also a Jew, and later became a Christian. And he said to the Nazi, how many Jews have you killed the last few weeks? Oh, he said, 25,000. In this particular village, how many did you kill? I killed everyone in that town. The man said, do you ever ask God for forgiveness? Oh, he says, God doesn't exist. There isn't any such thing as forgiveness. All right, said the husband. My wife is upstairs asleep. She's not heard this conversation. I'm going to ask her to come down. When she appeared before them, my friend said to his wife, Sabina, this is the man who killed your father, your mother, your 3 brothers and 2 sisters. She looked at him for a moment, then threw her arms around him, kissed him and said, as God forgives you, I forgive you. That forgiveness was the consequence of a Christian philosophy. Now, what is the philosophy behind abortion? That is to say, what is the set of values that determines the destruction of life? The philosophy behind the destruction of life is a misunderstanding of freedom and a misunderstanding of love. First of all, they understand freedom as the right to do whatever you please. We hear the young people say it today. For example, oh, I gotta be me. I gotta do my thing. I gotta be free. Nobody's going to stop me. There's an absolute denial of limits. The selfish ego determines its own, denies all limits, and regards any law as a restriction of freedom. Well, once you admit freedom as the right to do whatever you please, then look at the consequences. You can turn a machine gun on your neighbor's chickens. You can stuff Aunt Lizzie's mattress with old razor blades. The only stopping to doing whatever you please is power. And believe me, if we in America are going to develop this philosophy of doing whatever you please, there's going to be a reaction. And the reaction already has taken prisoner 1/3 of the people of the world. That's communism, which says, no, freedom is the right to do whatever you must. We say freedom is the right to do whatever you ought. But once that philosophy is proclaimed, that the ego is supreme, there are no limits, then abortion follows. I wonder when we ever got into this position of denying limits. I wonder why our young people are so concerned with their identity. 30 or 40 years ago, nobody had the problem of identity. Why not? Because he recognized boundaries, limits. How do you know the limits, for example, of the identity of the state of Illinois? By its boundary lines. How do you know the identity of a basketball court? By its foul lines. How do we know our own identity? By limits, by boundaries, by law, by order. And I think we lost all of these at 8:15 in the morning, August the 6th, 1945, when we dropped a bomb on Hiroshima. That bomb blotted out boundaries of life and death, civilian and the military, and trust among nations. And so abortion, from that point on, is defended on the ground that one may do whatever he pleases. That's the first false philosophy. The second is a misunderstanding of love. They understand love as an experience. Love is sex. And it doesn't make very much difference who the other person is. The fig leaf that in Greek sculpture was over the secret parts of man and woman is today put over the face. They don't care who gives them the exhilaration. It is only the experience itself that matters. The person does not count. You drink the water, you forget the glass. This is not the meaning of love. Love is reciprocal. It involves persons. And love also involves responsibility. And one of the reasons, the principal reason why there is abortion today is they are saying, well, I don't want to have myself disturbed. I don't want to care. I want no burden. I want to do whatever I please. I want to love myself. This is the philosophy. Now, with the result that America is being divided into two classes, biophilics and necrophilics. Now we're going to enjoy a little bit of Greek. Before I came on the stage, I asked the bishop how many people in the audience did he think had forgotten their classical Greek, and he said not over 8. Well, for the benefit of those 8, I will have to tell you the meaning of these words. In Greek, bios is life, and philia is love. Hence, the biophilic people are those who love life. Nekros in Greek is corpse. Philia is love. The people of America and the world are being divided into two classes. Into the biophilics who love life, the necrophilics who love death. The biophilics love life. And why? Because at the beginning, God made this constellation of heavens, and that's the way Genesis describes it. God made, God said, until we come to man. Then for the first time, we hear, as it were, the Trinity of persons entering into council and saying, let us make man. Because man was to be made to the divine image. The biophilics start there. They believe that God is the originator of life. And that is why they are impatient with those who say, oh, you don't know whether it's going to be human or not. Wait for 3 months, wait for 6 months. Is that true? Listen, the problem is not when human life begins. The problem is who made it? Who produced it? Lilies make lilies. Elephants make elephants. Human persons make human persons. You put, for example, Tchaikovsky's Piano Concerto No. 1 on a record, or Beethoven's Leonore. If you know music, as soon as you hear the first few notes, you know what it's going to be. The next half hour of that symphony will unfold just as you may predict. There are no musicians in that machine. There are no notes written on the tape. But it's all there from the very beginning. And just as soon as a husband and wife do the procreative act, there can be from the very beginning life. And that whole life is structured, written out, just as clearly to be human as the notes were written to be either, say, a Tchaikovsky or a Beethoven. The reason we are defending life, as I will show in a moment, is because there's a clock to life. And we're afraid of that clock unwinding. Nor is it true that love alone decides whether life is wanted. Remember the famous scene in the courtroom of Solomon? 2 prostitutes had children. During the night, one of the prostitutes rolled over on her baby and smothered it. The other prostitute took the dead baby and put it alongside of the other woman and kept the other child, the live one, for herself. In the morning, the real mother was accused of having killed her own babe. The case went to Solomon. Now, remember, both of these women wanted children. They had love for their children. That was not primary. Solomon said, bring the live child. Give me a sword. And he took the sword and he said, I will cut this babe in 2. I will give half to you and half to you. One of the women cried out, no, give her the other babe. Solomon said, you're the mother. And why was she the mother? Because she loved life. Life came before anything else. So we are biophilics. And the others are becoming necrophilics, the lovers of death. There is a killing of a young life by abortion every 20 seconds in the United States. There are as many babes killed by abortion in 9 days in the United States as men were killed in 9 years in the Vietnam War. 1/2 of all the babes that take life in a mother's womb in Washington, D.C. are mugged. Their life is taken from them. In New York City, out of every 10 children that are in the mother's womb, 5 are destroyed. We are becoming a civilization of death, and that is why, notice the type of movies, television, violence, destruction. Why is it that we live in an age of destructiveness and violence? It's simply because people have no interior life, they're not creating anything within themselves, and they're not creating human life. They're aborting it. And instead of creating life now by violence, they go out and destroy it. Freud was not so wrong when he spoke of eros thanatos. Here we get into Greek again. Eros, love, not the highest kind of love. Eros thanatos, Thanatos. Thanatos was death. Freud said, the sex given over wholly to satisfaction becomes abnormally interested in the death instinct. And that is what is happening today. During the Victorian days, sex was taboo. Today, death is taboo. You are not to speak about it. And so they use other words. Just like the communists would use the word liberation when they take over a country, so today it is said that a mother has a fetus. Who ever heard of a mother having a fetus? A mother is always with child. And that is just a kind of a verbal escape from admitting that there is life within. That brings me to the rapid progress toward death in our American culture. Once you begin to make a law, and remember that legality is not morality. Because the Supreme Court makes something legal, it does not necessarily make it moral. Who ever thought, for example, when the Reichstag passed its first law on Nordic supremacy, that there would be 6 million Jews incinerated in Belsen, Dachau, Auschwitz, and other torturous and horrendous prisons of Germany. But once you begin to give way, then there comes a very rapid decline. If you put a frog, for example, in a large bowl of water and make that water the normal, healthy temperature for a frog, and you heat that water imperceptibly, the smallest degree every day, eventually it will boil. You cannot point to one single day when that frog struggled against hot water. Death took it over so gradually that it almost seemed to be normal. And so a country that's given to death can imperceptibly sink and sink and sink